Hello, this is Martin Brennand, Product Manager of Manager Systems, and we're going to go through a webinar today for tracking screens with Mocha. So the topics we're going to discuss today are a quick planar tracking crash course, so we're going to just go quickly through how Mocha does what it does for those that aren't too familiar with the Mocha process. Then we're going to go straight into some complicated screens of various types. So first we're going to cover screens that go off-screen, and by this we mean not just screens that disappear off the edge of your frame, but also screens that get completely covered by other objects such as actors. We're also going to go through tracking with very little information, so when there's not enough texture detail in the shot. And we're also going to be using AdjustTrack for a few cases, one for checking for drift and the other for corners that you cannot see because they're covered by other objects. We'll then cover some shiny gadgets. In this case we're going to go over an iPad reflection, and then I'm going to show you a couple approaches to lens distortion and show that workflow in After Effects. Now, most of the things today we're going through are going to be covered both in After Effects and Mocha Pro, with one section which is going to go talk about briefly about rendering, but all of these techniques I'm going to show in Mocha Pro 3.2.1, and I'll let you know when and where you can use particular applications with each technique. So why the webinar? So screen replacement is very common. It's one of the most common visual effects things to do in the industry because there are so many screens in modern day films and future films for that matter. If you just look at a film, say for example Iron Man, for example, the amount of screens that go on there is quite incredible. Also, we've got screens are easy until you do them, and this is the case where normally when you look at a screen you can say that's pretty easy to track. It's a nice big rectangle, there's a lot of detail there, I can just draw a shape around it and I'm done. But often that is not the case. There's reflections to deal with, there's obstructions. Screens don't generally have a lot of texture on them, so they can be a little bit harder to track, and there's lots of different little cases like that. Screens are also Mocha's bread and butter. We started out with Monet. Monet was a fantastic tool that was used specifically back in our earlier days to track in 4-point corner pins, and that's evolved into Mocha AE's and Mocha Pro's tracking tools with the Surface to really get inserts and sell them in shots. So it's a great webinar to show you what Mocha's core tracking abilities are and where they're used. And of course there are many ways to track screens. So I'm going to go through now and start. I'll stop rabbiting on and we'll get straight into Mocha. Okay, so over in Mocha I'm going to load our first project. And we'll create our output directory. So this is a nice basic one to start with, just to sort of ease you in. We've got a screen up here in the top right corner. This is some footage from Wanderlust with level 256. Thank you very much for that. And we need to track this shot here. We've got a bit of smoke floating in the foreground here. We've got sort of a bit of blur, motion blur, and focal blur going on. And we're just going to use Mocha to track this screen, getting past all of those detail changes. So first of all, we want to look at the screen itself. We've got a big reflection of the trees in the TV here, so if I just scrub through that timeline, we can see there's that reflection there. And as I say, we've got this obstruction here, which is a little bit of smoke, and Mocha's going to pretty much ignore that because it's going to lock onto texture very well. So I'm going to draw some shapes now just to start this tracking process. So I'm going to draw an X-spline here, and you'll notice here that I am drawing a shape that is not around the television. The reason for this is that, one, the television is pretty much straight black, and also it's got a reflection on it. And reflections really are a separate plane within the surface, so Mocha will actually try and track that reflection rather than the actual thing you're trying to track. So what we want to do is use Mocha's ability to track other areas of the planes and then apply that planar tracking data to the area we actually want to work with. So I've just drawn a simple 4-point X-spline here, and if we turn on the map we can see that area. And if I just turn off my paint bucket for a second, we can just see that whole area of detail that Mocha is going to track. Now, you'll notice here too that we've got this cocktail shaker in the foreground. Now this cocktail shaker is not actually on the same plane as the speakers and gains and brick, but it's not actually providing any parallax in this plane either, so we can kind of cheat and use it as part of our planar surface to get a little bit more detail. You can also see I'm sort of being a bit rough. I'm not actually getting right inside the plane, I'm actually getting a bit of the background as well, and that actually helps Mocha to work out how this plane is moving. Now, because we do have extra detail, however, I am actually going to add a little bit more here. First of all, I'm going to bring this shape right down to the edge here, because if we scrub our timeline, we can see it comes down quite low, so I want to get as much detail as possible. And I'm also going to use the Add Shape to Spline tool and draw on the other side of the plane here. Again, all of this wall is on the same plane, so I can use every detail possible. So Mocha is great at doing this kind of stuff where you can add additional shapes, move them around, and then track all on that one plane. So I'm going to turn on the surface now, which is probably the most important thing you want to work with when dealing with screens in Mocha. The surface is the representation not just of the track, but also our 4-point corner pin when we export out to our applications. So I'm just going to turn off my layers for a second, and I'm just going to line it up on this television to begin with. Now you can line up this surface at any point during the track or when the track is finished, but I like to line it up to begin with just so that I have a starting point so I can see how my track is going. So I'm just going to line that up with the bottom of the TV there, and we'll just bring this down and make sure that's lining up correctly. It's not quite there. Let's pull that there. And then I'm just going to push that surface up just a little bit. So once I've got my surface in place, I can either choose to insert a sort of demo clip to see how that's looking, or I can just use the grid to see how the track is going. So I'm just going to turn off that grid for now. Let's just go back to none. You can also import your own in the insert clip, and we'll get onto that in a little while. So now that we've got our surface and our grid set up, I'm just going to turn those layers back on so I can see them. And we're going to quickly look at the parameters down here in the bottom. We've got our input channels, and I'm going to keep this at luminance. Luminance basically converts the whole thing to black and white, and it basically tries to find the contrast in that luminance. What auto channel will do is try and find the best detail in either R, G, or B channels, and usually you want to keep it on luminance, and if you're finding luminance isn't working for you, try auto channel instead. The next value here is the minimum percentage of pixels, and we want to keep that value quite high, so I'm going to set that to 90. Think of the minimum percentage of pixels used as accuracy versus speed. So the higher this value, the more accurate, but the slower the track will be. The lower it is, the less accurate it will be, and the faster it will be. So this all depends on the size of your footage, the size of the shapes, and the kind of tracking you're doing. So I generally aim for about 90 in most of my shots, and you're going to see that in pretty much all the shots I do today. So we're going to turn on perspective, because we do have some little bit of perspective shift in this shot, and everything else I'm going to leave alone. Most of the time, you don't ever have to touch the controls in the right side of this panel. We could go through the manual tracking section here, but today for screens, I'm going to not talk about this section here. So let's start tracking this shot. I'm going to call this one screen track, and we can start tracking forwards. So now Mocha is going through and analysing this shot. I can turn off my mats just to see the whole scene a little bit better. And we can see that's locking on very, very nicely. And as this goes up, you can see why I've added as much shape as possible, because we're losing a lot of this information as it goes out of the screen. But we're still locking on very nicely, even when this blur happens across the shot. So once we've got our blur and our full track done, we can go ahead and insert something. So I'm just going to import a logo here. Let's go to our inserts. I'm going to choose the Mocha logo just for a little bit of shameless promotion. And then we can see how that shot is looking. And we can see a little bit of drift happening here. So this is the first time I'm going to show you a little bit of how the AdjustTrack module works. So even though we've had a pretty decent track, I now need to use the AdjustTrack module just to fix a little bit of a problem over here. So I'm going to scrub back through the timeline and we'll just see where that starts to go wrong. We can start to see a little bit of drift happening here. So I'm going to just readjust my screen a little bit just to make sure that looks even. And when we get to about here, we can start to see that drift. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to move over to the AdjustTrack module. Now when you move over to the AdjustTrack module, it sets a master keyframe, and this may not be where you want it. So you can either choose to set the master at a different section and then reset, but in this case I'm just going to set master all for all four corners of my surface. So the AdjustTrack module works by adding another layer of information above the existing track. This means that we can fix drift by adding tweening keyframes on the timeline. So when I start to scrub through here, you can see that when I start to move, the master keyframe stays up in the top left corner, and then the current frame sits on my bottom view just here. So it's kind of hard to see what's going on this screen. So I'm going to use a reference point to help me out. So I'm going to generate a new reference point going forwards. And I'm going to push this down and just find that little corner here on the brick. I'm also going to do the same for the bottom corner. So we're just going to find an area over here. This one will do nicely here. So you can see down here we've got the four corners in the AdjustTrack representing the four corners in the surface. So when I click these, it will jump automatically to those corners in the view. This is handy if you're in close and you need to work without having to zoom out and see what the surface is doing. So I'm going to first work with that bottom corner, and we'll just select that reference point. And I'm just going to scrub forwards and see what it's doing. And that's holding on actually pretty well, so we can leave that one alone. We can see even with the focal blur, it's still pretty much in the same spot. I may just use the pixel nudges, this up, down, left, right, to nudge it down just a little bit. But overall, that's actually locked on pretty well. What I'm concerned about is this bottom right corner. So I'm going to click the bottom right corner of the surface tool inside the AdjustTrack module. And I'm going to drag to the end. And you can see here that it's drifted slightly over to the right. So I'm going to just use, again, the left tool here to just nudge that back to where it's supposed to be. So now when we scrub through, we're actually getting a much more realistic movement on that screen. So that's one way to use the AdjustTrack tool when you need to sort of adjust those areas. And now I'm going to go through a different shot where we talk about how to track when you've got a completely obstructed view of your screen. So let's move on to that version. Okay, so here we have our second shot, and this has been generously provided to us by Freddie Wrong from Rocket Jump. And this is from Video Game High School Season 2. So I'm going to want to track this screen in the background here, but we have a massive problem in that someone walks right in front of it. So obviously we need to rotate out the character, but that still doesn't help the fact that we can't see the screen anymore. So how do we track this? Well, like the previous example, we have a plethora of information behind the screen to work with, but this time it's not quite on the same plane. So to deal with this, what we need to do is track the background and then adjust for any drift that's in the shot. But this drift will be quite subtle, because if we just look and zoom in quite close here, you can see if we look at this corner on top of the postcard here, we don't actually have a lot of parallax going on. So we'll be able to get away with quite a bit without having to do any adjusting. So I'm just going to zoom back out, and we're going to start with the beginning of the shot. They say starting at the beginning is always a good place to start. So I'm going to draw a large shape on screen. And I'm going to avoid the screen again, just going to grab a little bit of it around here. And we've got all of this texture information to work with here. I'm just going to check the brightness there, and that's actually looking pretty good. So I'm going to track this area, and I'm going to do the same again. I'm going to turn on my surface, and I'm going to bring it down onto the screen to line it up. So I'll turn back on that brightness and brighten it up a little bit so we can see what we're doing. And I'm going to zoom in here so we can see that surface, and use, again, that top left-hand corner zoom window to help line up the edges of this screen. Now, it gets a bit tricky down here because we've got an obscured corner covered by this pamphlet down the bottom, and an obscured corner with the can over here. So what I'm going to have to do is use the edges of my screen to kind of guess where those final edges are. So I'm going to come right down to the bottom, and that looks about right. So I'll just push this up just a little bit, make sure we're right on those edges. And that looks about right. So I'm just going to zoom out again. And then we can start doing our track. So I'm going to turn off the brightness there. And we're going to turn on about 90% pixels and perspective again, and start tracking forwards. So as he comes into the shot, we're going to have to manipulate our shape as we track. So he'll come into here, and as soon as his red hat starts to hit this part of the shape, we're going to have to start manipulating our shape to avoid him. The other way we could do this, of course, would be to actually mask him out completely and then just do a big track, but I'm going to show you one method of doing it this way, where we move the shape to avoid the obstructions. So as he comes forwards, he's about to hit, so I'm just going to stop the track there, and I'm just going to start moving the shape around. So we're just going to manipulate that a little bit. Don't want to manipulate my surface, just this spline. I'm just going to turn off that spline for a second and just move this down. And move it across. And keep on tracking. So as he comes across here, again his hat is going to come there, so I'm just going to nudge that forward a frame. And then again we need to move the shape, so I'm going to move it forwards again. And now we've got some information coming over here, so I'm going to draw a new shape using the Add to Spline tool. This is again using a sort of track as you go kind of workflow, so I'm going to grab a little bit of that door there. I'm going to add another shape up here as well. So now we're using 3 areas to capture this back wall and to avoid him. So now as he's coming across the main part of the screen, I'm going to start slowing it down. I'm going to go frame by frame just to watch how the track is going. And now he's really starting to encroach on my area. So I'm going to have to start adding more data behind him and start to tweak this shape here as well. So I'm going to delete this point up here, move this across a little bit, and let's keep on tracking forwards. So again, he's going to hit that shape there. So we'll just keep on inching that forwards, and we'll finish this off here. So we'll move this over a little bit. I'm going to draw another shape just down here on these objects, just to keep that detail going. I'm going to grab these 2 points and move them across, like so. Just going to get rid of this point now, just to make it quicker. And we'll keep edging across, so we can see now that even more information. So I'm going to add a new point to this shape, pull that down, and we'll just edge forward one more. That's a little bit too far, so I'm just going to pull back one. And I'm now going to get rid of this shape entirely, so I'm just going to delete these points. So that's gone. And I'll just use these back shapes now. So let's keep tracking forwards. add some more. Now this shape is becoming useless here, so I'm just going to grab all of these points and move them over here. And the same goes for these ones down here. I'm just going to come down here, and I might just delete this one now. And we'll just keep tracking forwards. So you can see this is actually a slightly more tedious process, but it means that our shape is going to, our track is going to be a lot more accurate when we get to the final point. So I'm going to move all this down now. Like so, and like so. And let's grab this area. And let's keep tracking forwards. So now we should be right for the rest of the shot. Let's see. So that grid is still remaining quite solid. It's locking onto those final edges. And I think we're good, because we no longer have our obstruction in the way, so we can lock onto that and just keep on tracking forwards. So as I said, this is quite a much more lengthy process to track, but it means that you're not going to spend a very long time tweaking back in either After Effects or Nuke or your external application, or doing a lot of adjust tracking inside Mocha. So I'm just going to scrub back through and we'll have a look at that. So I'm going to quickly insert a clip here. I'm going to import from my inserts here. Let's just put our shameless promotion back into our shot, and we'll see how that's looking. And that's actually tracked in very, very well. So this kind of manipulation, you can see our shapes are going all over the place. They're sort of warping in and out, they're jumping all over the place, but it doesn't matter because the shapes don't actually move the track. They're just our search areas. So we can add and remove as many times as we like as we go through the shot. So now let's take a look at an example where the screen itself almost disappears out of the shot and we don't have enough detail to work with. So I'm going to come across to a new shot. Okay, so in this example, we have a blue screen that is almost completely going out of the shot. But this area is actually quite easy to track. We've got a lot of texture detail, but as we look at the end of the shot, we don't actually have that much detail to work with at all. Even if I up my brightness here to have a look, we've really only got this top little area here, and that is kind of difficult. So in this case, we have to draw a sort of specialized shape to make sure that we get as much detail as possible. So first of all, I'm going to select my X-Spline tool again, and I'm just going to draw a big shape around the top of this screen. And then I'm going to cut off the screen edges, so we keep a little bit of that screen edge, and if I turn off my paint button again, we can see how that looks. So I'm grabbing the edges of the screen as well as the little bits of detail up here. So again, there's not much to work with here, but this will be enough texture information for Mocha to help track. So I'm going to turn on my pixels here, 90%, and again, perspective. And in this case, I'm also going to turn on my surface, but we don't actually see the end of the screen. So let's see how we fix that up. So I'm going to just set up my surface just lined up on the outside of the screen here, like so. And I'm just at the moment going to line it up with the edge. Because I can't see the bottom corner in this particular frame, I'm going to have to adjust my surface later to actually see if the actual screen has worked well. So now that I've got that set up, I'm going to call this one again, screen track. Always label your tracks. And we can begin to track backwards. So this is now jumping through and analyzing just that little matte area around here, but it's capturing all that little subtle detail in the shot. So as we come up here, it's grabbing a little bit more of the detail that appears at the top of the screen. And then it will actually capture the rest down the bottom. And we're going to have to add a new shape when that additional texture information turns up. So here we go down. I'll turn back on my main view. So as we start to come down here, I'm going to start adding some new shapes. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And I'm going to draw a fairly big shape here. I'm going to avoid the foreground arm. And we're just going to grab that area like that. Oops. Now you can see here the mistake I've made. I've drawn a layer instead of add to layer. So I'm just going to trash that. Add to shape. And we'll try that again. So I'm going to keep tracking backwards. Okay, so now that we have the rest of our shape, we can actually pull down our surface to get the full screen. So I'm going to come down to about here, and we're going to pull that surface edge down to the bottom corner, just like that. And again, I'm going to use that same technique I used before to just line up the edges to find that bottom left corner. So let's just scrub through the timeline and take a look at it. And that's looking pretty good, so we can probably deal with that. So now that we have this screen, I'm just going to center that back in the middle. I can then export that out to file. And in this case, I'm just going to quickly bring this out to After Effects so we can see how we would kind of finish up this shot with a particular blue screen. I'm not going to go into massive detail, but I just want to show you the export data you can use inside Mocha. So here we have our export options in the export tracking data dialog. We have the After Effects options, which is the corner pin and transform. For the most part in After Effects and Mocha for After Effects, you're going to be using the corner pin export for screens. Rarely will you use the transform data for a screen because you do need to deal with those four corners. So I generally recommend using supports motion blur because this will actually allow you to apply the motion blur effect inside After Effects when using a corner pin effect. By default, the corner pin effect does not do motion blur, so we add some additional translation, scale, and rotation to the layer so that you get the correct motion blur. The other options that we have for Mocha Pro are Simulate Scratch, Autodesk Products, Avid DS, Boris, Digital Fusion, Final Cut, Motion, Nuke, Quantel, and good old Shake. But in this case, I'm going to use the After Effects corner pin and just copy that to the clipboard. So now I can go over to After Effects and then paste this into the shot. Okay, so here we are in After Effects, and I've already got my footage inserted into a composition. And we're going to just do a quick insert into this shot. So I'm going to throw it on my targeting screen. And you can see here that the targeting screen is actually not the same size as my footage. Now this can be a problem in After Effects because the corner pin is based off the image size, not the composition size. So it can get a little bit skewed in the shot. So the way we fix this is that we can pre-comp this insert and make it the same dimension. So I'm going to just press Command or Control Shift C. We'll bring up the new composition. And we're just going to say move all attributes into the new composition. And I'm just going to call this one Target Screen Square Insert. And click OK. We can then go into our composition. And we're just going to select the layer and go up to Layer, Transform, and choose Fit to Comp. And then the insert will stretch to the full dimensions of the comp. So I can close that now. And now when we select our insert, we can go up to Edit and choose Paste. And our corner pin information will sit in the correct spot. So we can just drag that through and you can see that's sitting in the right spot. Now to wrap up this shot, we'd want to actually blue screen out the front. I'm not going to do a complete key here, but I'm just going to quickly show you an example of how that would look. So I'm going to duplicate my background layer, I'm going to put it on the foreground layer, and then I'm going to do a quick key light. So I'm going to come into keying and use key light, and then we're going to pick this and we'll find a nice area. Let's just drag this out of the way. and we'll find a good area to work with, about there. Okay, and now we've got this sitting nicely in the view with our shoulder sitting over the top, and the monitor's got a nice little soft edge on it because we've done the key. And then we'd go through and add the additional grain and all that kind of stuff. But that's basically how the workflow between the corner pin expert in Mocha and the keying inside After Effects would work. So that's tracking a difficult shot using the edges of the screen. And now we're going to look at attacking reflections. Okay, so back inside Mocha, let's load up our next file. So this is a common situation. We've got a very shiny tablet, and the only thing we can see on the tablet is reflection. We've got some trees here, we've got some power lines, and we've got a face as well. And everything is really high contrast and in sharp definition, so that reflection is going to be treated as a plane by Mocha. So how do we avoid this reflection? We can't really track the actual plane itself, and we can't track the background because it's too far away and it's not moving. So the way we do this is we try and give Mocha as much planar detail as possible without actually giving it the full information. So to do this, we draw a large shape around the edge of our plane. So I'm going to go all the way down, like so, grabbing that whole area. Now this by itself obviously is not going to work because we've got that plane captured. So the next thing we need to do is draw a new shape inside the layer using Add Spline to Layer. And then we cut out the edges. So I'm going to come around here and just cut out as much as possible. I'm going to get right down the bottom here, grab that edge. I'm going to come around here, make sure we've got all that, and I'm also going to just add a little bit more there. Let's say that's about that. So we're going to use just this edge area to try and capture that plane, and it may be enough. You can see here we're using some of the thumb and the sum of the thumb on this side, but we're also grabbing the edge past that thumb as well, just to capture a little bit of where the thumb detail meets the surface. So I'm going to turn on my surface and my grid, and we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to line up our surface area. Let's just do it roughly quickly first, and then we will line it up with those edges of the screen. I'm going to turn off my grid for a second just so we can see a little bit better. And again, I'm going to use those zoom windows to make sure my corners are in the right spot. Let's just turn off the layers as well so we can see. So that's lined up there. And we'll line that one up about there. So that's looking pretty good. So once we've got this, we can now begin our track. So again, we do all the fun stuff. We turn on the 90% pixels, we turn on perspective, and we call it screen track. I'm sure you're sick of me saying that, but it's very important to name your layers. I'm also going to save my project so that I have it ready just in case I want to make any changes. So I'm going to turn off a few things here. Let's just turn off, we'll turn off the layers, and we'll just keep the grid in place. And then we can start tracking forwards. So we can see there it's actually locking down really, really nicely. And now when we play back, you can see a nicely locked off screen using just those edges. So let's just turn back on that matte. And we can go ahead and insert something here. So I'm just going to import something here. Let's import our Mocha logo again, like so. Now that's actually the wrong way around, so I'm going to actually rotate it in space. So I'm going to come down to my insert tool. I'm going to go to my rotation, and I'm just going to set that to 90. So now that we've got this, we can either, again, choose to export it out using the export offset data. Because I've rotated it 90 degrees, I would export offset data from Mocha Pro rather than use the export track. Alternatively, if you don't have the insert tool and you're using Mocha for After Effects, you can just, let's set that back, you can actually go back to the track and actually manipulate your shape. So we can actually move these corners around and do it that way. But because I've got the insert tool, I'm lazy, so I just set in 90 degrees and do it that way. So there's one of the advantages of using Mocha Pro. So again, we can just export that out using the tracking data, using After Effects corner pin, and again, we can copy that to the clipboard and bring it out to whichever application we need. So I'm just going to cancel that because we're not going to show that one today. And finally, we're going to go through some lens distortion techniques to show you how to insert screens when you've got to deal with lens warp. Okay, so let's load up a new shot. So here we have a simple pan down shot. I'm just going to brighten this up a little bit. And if we drag through this shot, you can see it pans and then it turns to the side a little bit there. But we also notice here that we've got a curve in our lens that we need to accommodate for when we insert into the shot. So how do we do that? We can use the lens tool inside Mocha Pro and Mocha AE. Now I need to emphasize that the lens tool is currently only available in Mocha AE and Mocha Pro that you buy from Imagineer. This lens tool is not available in the bundled CC or After Effects versions of Mocha AE. So we want to use this lens tool to actually calibrate the lens that's in the shot. So to do this, we tell Mocha to locate the lines in the scene just by clicking. And Mocha throws up a whole bunch of lines and says, hey, do these lines need to be straight? And then we need to tell it which ones actually do. So for example, over here, obviously this line here, we want to keep curved. But this one is actually supposed to be straight. So what I do is I use new line, or I press the N key, and I do a little bit of a join the dots to say, Mocha, you need to make this line straight, so adjust the lens accordingly. So we want to tell it a few lines to make sure that it calibrates the lens correctly. So I'm going to press N again, and I'm going to get this bottom part of the television. And I'm going to do the same on this side and on this side. And you want to create a new line for any new segment that you make in a different area. Now, if you don't have a scene that has straight lines in it, you can actually bring in a calibration grid to help you out using the calibration clip. By default, it just uses the input clip. Now, in this case, since we're talking about screens, that's probably not going to be necessary. You will have straight lines in the scene because you're using screens. So in this case, we've got all the lines that we need, and about 4 around the screen is enough. And then I'm going to set the parameters for the calibration. So we have one parameter distortion, and this is basically a barrel distortion. So it works out a point in the center and then warps from those points based on the lines you've selected to calibrate. The 2 parameter distortion is very useful when you need to work with a more warpy lens. So for example, a fisheye lens often has a little bit of a warp that flattens out on the edges before it bulges in the middle. So that's where the 2 parameters is useful. And then we have anamorphic and distortion maps. Distortion maps are very useful if you're, say, done a lens distortion in, say, Nuke and you've rendered out an ST map. You can bring that inside Mocha to use there. But here, I'm going to stick to good old 1 parameter distortion, and this is probably the classic case of distortions. And then we can just click Calibrate. So you can't see much of a change here because it's a subtle distortion, so I'll turn on the grid, and we can see that warp a little bit more obviously. So once we've got our warp, we can then do 2 different things. We can either choose to render it flat, so I'll turn off my grid for a second and render, and that actually renders our object flat. We can choose to track into the shot, which is what we're going to do here, and that will actually distort our inserts with the lens distortion. And we can also export the lens data, which we're also going to do in this case to show you an example inside After Effects. So I'm going to start the track first because we want to deal with that, and then I'll come back here and show you the lens data options. So to do this, I'm just going to turn on my spline tool. Let's just start drawing a shape here. And I'm going to do a very basic shape around here. And again, I'm going to brighten that up just a little bit because it's quite dark, this scene. And we'll pan down a little bit. And I'm going to make sure I get all of those edges. Now, when you draw the shape, you're going to notice that you can't really notice the lens distortion. But when I turn on my surface, we can really start to see that warp that's in the lens. So I'm going to put that to fit the edges of my screen. And again, I'm using the top left-hand corner to zoom into those corners to make sure that they're sitting just outside that edge. I prefer to sit just outside the edge so that I've got a bit of wiggle room to work with when I do my composition later. So I've done my 4 corners now, and again, our happy little friends, 90% pixels, perspective, and screen track. So we've got our warp, and we can now begin to track. So this will now track with the lens distortion in place. So I'm going to start tracking forwards. Now as I come down here, because we have a fairly blank plastic sort of edge here, there's not a lot of texture detail. So I'm going to stop here and actually draw a new shape. And again, using our information that we used in previous examples, I'm just going to use something that looks like it's on the same plane. I'm going to draw a little shape down here. So now we've got 2 shapes and we're covering this little bit of section down here. This is just to make sure that when we get to the bottom corner, our surface does not slip. So let's keep on tracking. Now in this example we could go ahead and use the same lens distortion to track every single screen, but you'll get the general idea from this specific example. I don't want to bore you by going through every single screen in this example, so we'll keep to the main shot just for the time being. Now when we actually record this, I may actually pause this and just edit out the boring track part of this shot. Okay, so now our track is finished. We can have a look and see how that's going, and we can still see a little bit of distortion happening at the bottom here. So we're going to do the same thing as we did last time. This actually looks like a very casual drift that happens, so I'm going to go back over to AdjustTrack, and we're just going to deal with the bottom 2 corners. So we'll come right to the end, and you can see quite an amazing drift happening there. So I'm going to come down to Auto in my bottom left AdjustTrack, and just pop that back. And the same with the bottom right. And let's just have a quick look now back in the main window. We'll just zoom out a little bit and we'll just drag that through. And I'm pretty happy with the way that looks. So we can go to now go into After Effects to finish off this shot. So the way we do this, we're in the AdjustTrack module, so I want to actually use export tracking data from AdjustTrack. So I'm going to export the tracking data, and again I'm going to use After Effects corner pin. Now here's the difference when we work with the lens module to underdistort the track. Regardless of the type you're doing, whether you're flattening the shot or you're adding back into the shot, when you export your 4 corner pin, you want to remove the lens distortion from your shot. The reason for this is that if you flatten the shot, you need to remove the lens distortion from your insert so that it sits in the scene better in After Effects. But if you're actually going to apply the lens distortion to the shot, you need to remove the lens distortion first so you can apply the lens data back on top to curve your corner pin. And this will make a lot more sense when we bring it in. So I'm going to remove the lens distortion and copy it to the clipboard. Now let's go over to After Effects and we'll continue the shot. Okay, so over in After Effects, I'm just going to get rid of this shot and load up my lens. So I'm not going to save this particular shot. So we've already got our footage loaded in here, and I'm going to bring in an insert. Let's bring in another targeting screen. And I'm going to just drag that on top of my footage here. So when we paste in our tracking data by just going to Edit and Paste, you can see it's actually sitting right in the same spot, but it's very, very square. This is because we haven't applied the lens distortion yet to the shot. So to fix that, what we need to do is we need to pre-comp our targeting screen first because we want to apply the lens data to the entire comp area. So I'm going to pre-comp and move all attributes because we want to move that corner pin inside the pre-comp. So I'm going to call this one target screen insert. And then I'm going to go back into Mocha Pro to finish off grabbing my lens data. Okay, so inside Mocha Pro, we're going to go back to the lens tool, and we can go to the Export Lens Data button. So in here we have a few options. We've got Mocha Lens Data for After Effects, and this is available in both Mocha AE and Mocha Pro, but we also have Distortion Map, and that's only available inside Mocha Pro. The Mocha Pro Distortion Map lets you render out a UV map to things like new, confusion, and smoke to do your lens distortions that way, but we won't cover that today. If you want to actually check out how the distortion maps work, you can check out our other tutorials on lens distortion. So I'm going to choose the Mocha Lens for After Effects today and just copy that to the clipboard. And then we can go over to After Effects. Okay, so back over in After Effects, we've got our pre-comp done. And you can see there the four corners of our comp, set it to the full screen. And again, all we have to do is come up and say paste, because we've got our lens data again on the clipboard. And now it's actually warping the shot. But you can see it's actually warping it the wrong way. And this is because initially the effect actually undistorts your shot. So we need to go to our effect controls. So under the Mocha Lens plugin, we have a few options here to define the footage width and whether or not it's the comp size or the footage size. But here I want to, instead of removing distortion, I want to apply it. Now you can see the curve is actually sitting correctly in the screen. If I turn on and off the effect, you can see now that it's actually applying the distortion correctly in the shot. Now if we wanted to do the reverse of this, if we wanted to actually export out the flattened version, we would have to apply the lens effect to our footage layer and use the remove distortion before we pasted our tracking data. So that's the two workflows. You've got either to paste in the distortion to your insert and apply the distortion, or select your footage and apply the remove distortion to flatten out the actual footage layer. Of course, the other way you could do this is actually not use any of this at all. No pre-comp, no data, no Mocha Lens. What you could do instead is use the render tool inside Mocha Pro. So let's go back over to Mocha Pro and have a look at that. Right, so back over in Mocha Pro, we've still got our insert here, and I'm going to go back to my track tab, and I'm going to use the insert clip to bring in that insert that we chose for After Effects. So I'm going to grab the targeting screen, open that up, and import it in. And now we've got our shot sitting in the screen with the correct distortion already set up. Now the advantage of this is that we can now go to the Insert tool and actually do some pre-composition work before we export it out as a render to After Effects. So to do this, we can either adjust the opacity, or we can adjust the gain to brighten that up. And in this case, I'm just going to keep those as 1 and 1 because I want to do that work inside After Effects, but it's good to be able to just quickly adjust these things if necessary. You can also show the mesh. I'm just going to turn off the grid for this and show the mesh. The mesh is like a mini grid that lets you actually warp your screen to actually assist in adjustments. I'm going to, again, not bother with that because we've got a nice, easy screen to work with here. But keep in mind, the warp tool is a very powerful tool to use if you need to do any kind of quick distortion work, especially when you're working with cloth or need to do tiny, minor warp adjustments in your shot. It's a very useful but often underutilized feature, so check that one out. So I'm just going to undo that warp. In this case, I am actually going to apply motion blur, so I don't have to do it inside Mocha. And because I'm rendering, the motion blur would not apply anyway. So I'm going to do motion blur at about 0.25, and I'm going to leave my comp settings alone. We can set the comp settings to actually apply the layer matte to help cut out things, but I'm just going to do a plain old render with motion blur. So let's just turn off that mesh, and we'll start rendering forwards. So now what this is doing is actually applying the motion blur of the camera that we've tracked with the lens distortion, and then rendering that out to file. Now the good thing about this is it actually does a few passes. It does a composite pass, and it also does a layer pass. So it means that you can split out the insert with an alpha and apply it back inside After Effects as an additional comp. We also deal with the layer matte, so if you want to set up a more tight matte around your insert, you can also render out the matte and then use that as a track matte around your screen edge to sort of get a really nice comped in shot. In this case I wouldn't do that because we have some green screen going on here, so I would actually do a key, but it's good to know all the options that are available to you. So I've done that render now, and that's almost finished at the edge there. So now we can have a look at that. We've already rendered the composite, and we've also got a layer file called layer that gives us our alpha channel with the insert. We can then go ahead and then export a rendered clip of that layer. So I'm going to come up here, and it automatically selects our layer file, and we can start to export out the render settings. So I'm going to choose an image sequence, and I'm going to choose, in this case, a TIFF sequence, and I'm going to choose my folder, so I'll choose my Mocha Screens demo folder, and we'll get our insert render folder and choose that. And we'll leave the prefix alone, it's got a nice layer there, and I'm going to click OK. And now that's exporting out my clip I've rendered. I can go back over to After Effects and then import that entire distorted and motion blurred clip into my shot. Okay, so back over in After Effects, I'm just going to delete my data insert that I did with the lens tool and my tracking data, and I'm going to import a new file. So let's load that up. I'm going to come to my insert render folder, and we're going to select our layer, and I'm going to do it straight and unmatted, and we'll make sure it's the same dimensions and same frame rate, so 24 frames per second as well as 93 frames, and then we can drag that into our shot, and it just sits immediately in the shot and works. So you can imagine this is a much faster workflow to work with. You've got a motion blur pre-rendered matte file in Mocha Pro that just dumps straight into the shot, and then you can start playing around with it. It means that you're not having to render an effect, you're not having to render motion blur. It's a whole lot quicker to do it inside Mocha Pro, preview it very quickly with our fast render cache tool, and then render it out as a clip and bring it into After Effects. So they're the two workflows. You can either use Mocha Pro to render the insert, or you can use the export of tracking data and the lens plugin for After Effects and bring in the data so you've got a bit more sort of flexibility with changing effects and changing keyframes. Okay, so that's all we've got time for today, but let's quickly go through a summary of what we covered today. So we can track anywhere but the screen in most cases. You want to avoid the screen itself because it's a big shiny glass thing that reflects everything and shows either little detail or too much detail. You could fix this with tracking markers, but that's more post work you have to do, so if you can avoid tracking markers and track everywhere else around the screen, definitely do that method. Now, something we didn't really cover today, but I want to emphasize, is scrub your timeline at least a few times to see where you can track, and this will really help reduce the amount of tracking that you have to do. So in the case of the rocket jump shot with the guy walking past the screen, we had to go through and look at the wall a couple of times to see how it was going to move. And then as we tracked forwards, it was easy to kind of move and adjust those points as we went. But we really had to sort of focus and make sure that we looked at our track as we went. Thirdly, we want to avoid those reflections. Reflections are another plane within your surface, so Mocha will look at that and track that instead. And often with screens, the reflection is actually the most detail that you'll have in a shot, which is really annoying, but we just have to live with it. Now, we have to use AdjustTrack in a lot of different situations. We generally try to use it when there's drift occurring, and you saw me use that in a couple of situations there, but it's also really useful for finding corners that we can't see. And finally, you can render to reduce your time elsewhere. This is really handy for that final shot where we needed to do lens distortion and tracking and motion blur all in the same insert, and we were able to do that all inside Mocha Pro without having to export the tracking data and then export the lens plugin data and then do a final composite inside After Effects. Finally, if you want to learn more about Mocha AE and Mocha Pro, you can go to the internet and go to imagineersystems.com, where we have all of the product information, tutorials, documentation, and so on. We also have tutorial sites at vimeo.com/imagineer and youtube.com/imagineersystems. We have our Facebook site at facebook.com/imagineersystems, and we have the Twitter feed at imagineersystem, minus the S, because Twitter only allows 15-character usernames. And check out the hashtag Mocha Tips on both Facebook and Imagineer System, where we post short little tips about Mocha Pro and Mocha AE. So that's been Tracking Screens with Mocha. I've been Product Manager Martin Brennand, and we hope to see you next time for another webinar.